The art of espionage has always been a game of shadows, but nowhere was this craft refined into such a precise science as within the walls of the Lubyanka, the notorious headquarters of the Committee for State Security, better known to the world as the KGB. Between 1954 and 1991, this organization perfected methods of counterintelligence that would become legendary in the annals of spycraft, creating comprehensive guides and training manuals that transformed the detection of foreign operatives from intuitive guesswork into systematic methodology. What emerged from decades of Cold War paranoia and genuine security concerns was nothing less than a complete philosophy of suspicion, a detailed roadmap for identifying the enemy among the masses, built upon hard lessons learned from spectacular failures and quiet successes that most of the world would never hear about. The foundation of KGB counterintelligence doctrine can be traced directly to the catastrophic penetrations of Soviet intelligence networks during the late Stalin era and the years immediately following his death in 1953. The defection of Igor Guzenko in Ottawa in September 1945 had exposed extensive Soviet spy rings across North America, while the subsequent unmasking of the Cambridge Five beginning in 1951, with the flight of Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean to Moscow, revealed both the extent of Soviet penetration into British intelligence and the vulnerability of such networks once compromised. These events convinced the leadership of the newly reorganized KGB under Ivan Serov that counterintelligence required a more sophisticated approach than the blunt instrument of mass surveillance and arbitrary arrest that had characterized the NKVD years under Lavrenti Beria. The KGB's methodology for detecting foreign intelligence operatives rested on several fundamental principles that were codified in training materials at the Higher Intelligence School, also known as the Red Banner Institute, located in the Yasenevo district of Moscow. The first and most critical principle was that every foreign national on Soviet soil should be presumed to have some form of intelligence value, either as a potential agent or as a target for recruitment. This assumption shaped every interaction between Soviet citizens and foreigners, creating an environment where the entire population became, in effect, an extension of the counterintelligence apparatus. By 1960, the second chief directorate of the KGB, responsible for internal counterintelligence, employed approximately 15,000 officers directly, but could call upon hundreds of thousands of informants who had been cultivated across every sector of Soviet society. The detection process began long before a suspected spy ever set foot on Soviet territory. KGB analysts working in the First Department of the Second Chief Directorate maintained extensive biographical files on foreign diplomats, journalists, businessmen, students, and tourists who applied for Soviet visas. These files drew upon information gathered from open sources, including professional publications, university records when accessible, and social connections that could be traced through various means. When the American journalist Louis Fisher applied for a visa to return to the Soviet Union in 1956, after years of absence, KGB analysts produced a dossier exceeding 200 pages that detailed his previous contacts in Moscow during the 1930s, his subsequent disillusionment with Soviet communism, and an assessment of whether his return indicated genuine journalistic interest or potential intelligence gathering. The depth of this pre-arrival analysis allowed KGB officers to construct what they called a legend profile, essentially a prediction of what an intelligence operative using a particular cover identity should look like in terms of behavior, knowledge, and social patterns. Once a foreigner arrived in the Soviet Union, surveillance began immediately and operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The most visible level involved physical surveillance teams known as external observation units, which the KGB organized with remarkable sophistication by the early 1960s. A typical surveillance operation on a suspected intelligence officer from a Western embassy might involve between 20 and 30 personnel working in rotating shifts, using a combination of foot surveillance, vehicle tracking, and static observation posts. The KGB maintained apartments and offices in buildings surrounding foreign embassies specifically for this purpose. In Moscow, nearly every building within 2 blocks of the American Embassy on Tchaikovsky Street had at least one KGB observation post by 1965, equipped with cameras, listening devices, and logs that recorded every person entering or leaving the embassy compound. But physical surveillance, while important, represented only the most superficial layer of the detection apparatus. The KGB understood that skilled intelligence officers could detect and evade physical surveillance, a capability that CIA officers called going black and practiced extensively. The real art of counterintelligence lay in what the KGB termed operational environment control, the systematic manipulation of a target's entire experience within the Soviet Union to force revealing behaviors. This concept emerged from the analytical work of General Oleg Gribanov, who headed the Second Chief Directorate from 1955 to 1964 and transformed it from a reactive security service into a proactive counterintelligence machine. Operational environment control began with the simple reality that foreigners in the Soviet Union existed in a carefully constructed bubble. Hotels where foreigners stayed, such as the Metropole, the National, and especially the Ukraina, employed staff members who reported to the KGB. These were not merely informants in the casual sense, but trained observers who understood what to look for. A chambermaid at the Hotel Metropole in 1962 would be trained to note whether a guest's belongings had been rearranged in a manner suggesting the guest had conducted a search for listening devices, whether papers were left in positions that would reveal if they had been examined during the guest's absence, whether the guest used excessive amounts of writing paper that might indicate encrypted message preparation, and whether items appeared in the room that had not been brought through customs. The KGB maintained a dedicated training facility outside Moscow where hotel workers, restaurant staff, taxi drivers, and in-tourist guides spent weeks learning observation techniques and memorizing indicators of intelligence activity. The restriction of foreigners to specific hotels and the requirement that they use official in-tourist guides for travel outside major cities served multiple purposes beyond simple surveillance. It created what counterintelligence theorists called pattern disruption opportunities. If a foreign visitor was genuinely a tourist or a legitimate journalist, their behavior would conform to expected patterns. They would want to see famous sites. They would ask predictable questions. They would show interest in cultural and historical subjects appropriate to their stated purpose. An intelligence officer operating undercover, however, would eventually need to deviate from these patterns to accomplish their actual mission. They might request to visit locations that had no obvious tourist appeal but were near sensitive installations. They might show excessive interest in mundane details about industrial production or transportation infrastructure. Or they might attempt to separate from their assigned guide at moments that suggested a clandestine meeting. The KGB developed extensive psychological profiles of how intelligence officers behaved under the stress of operating in a hostile environment. These profiles drew upon interrogations of captured spies, debriefings of Soviet intelligence officers who had served abroad, and careful analysis of the few Western intelligence training manuals that had been obtained through various means. One such manual, portions of which the KGB acquired in 1959 through a source in British intelligence, revealed that Western officers were trained to maintain consistent cover stories through repetition and to avoid showing interest in subjects outside their cover identity. The KGB response was to create situations that would test the limits of a suspect's cover story through what they called stress mapping. A typical stress mapping operation might unfold over several weeks. Consider the case of a supposed British businessman who arrived in Moscow in 1967, claiming to represent a textile machinery manufacturer seeking to establish trade relationships. His initial interviews with Soviet trade officials would proceed normally, but KGB officers, posing as ministry representatives, would gradually introduce complications and inconsistencies into the discussions. They might reference technical specifications that differed slightly from industry standards to see if the businessman corrected them with the expertise a genuine representative would possess. They might mention company executives or facilities that did not exist to determine if the target claimed false familiarity. They might create bureaucratic delays that would frustrate a legitimate businessman into revealing genuine business knowledge and concerns, while an intelligence officer maintaining a cover story might show suspicious patience or might use the delays as opportunities to travel within Moscow in ways that suggested other purposes. The KGB paid particular attention to what they termed competence boundaries. Every cover identity had natural limits to the knowledge and capabilities it implied. A journalist should know about journalism, editorial processes, and the media landscape of their home country. They should not display detailed knowledge of cryptographic procedures, surveillance detection techniques, or the internal organization of intelligence services. When the American journalist John Barron arrived in Moscow in 1965, ostensibly to cover cultural events, KGB officers engaged him in conversations that gradually expanded into discussions of Soviet security practices. Barron, who was indeed a journalist, but one with extensive intelligence community contacts, demonstrated knowledge of KGB organizational structure that far exceeded what his cover identity should have provided. This anomaly triggered intensive surveillance that eventually contributed to his expulsion in 1966 and his subsequent authorship of KGB, The Secret Work of Soviet Secret Agents, published in 1974, which revealed much of what he had learned during his time under KGB scrutiny. Technical surveillance formed another critical layer of the detection apparatus. The Soviet Union invested enormous resources in developing sophisticated listening devices and hidden cameras, but the KGB's approach to technical surveillance went far beyond simply planting bugs in hotel rooms. The organization understood that experienced intelligence officers expected surveillance and would take precautions, so the goal was not merely to overhear conversations, but to observe how targets behaved when they believed they were conducting counter-surveillance. The pattern of behavior when someone was checking for listening devices could be as revealing as anything they might say. The KGB equipped certain hotel rooms with what they called complete coverage systems that included not just audio surveillance, but also cameras hidden behind mirrors and in ventilation grates, pressure sensors in floors that could track movement patterns throughout the room, and even devices that could detect the electromagnetic emissions from electronic equipment. These comprehensive systems allowed analysts to observe the complete routine of a suspected intelligence officer over days or weeks. Did they conduct a systematic search for listening devices upon entering the room? Did they use a radio or run water to create acoustic cover when having sensitive conversations? Did they write notes and then destroy them in ways that suggested the notes contained information they could not risk having discovered? Did they maintain their cover identity's behavioral patterns even in private? Or did they relax in ways that revealed different training or background? One of the most revealing indicators the KGB identified was what they termed operational awareness, the subtle signs that someone had been trained in intelligence tradecraft. This manifested in dozens of small behaviors that individually might mean nothing but collectively painted a picture. An intelligence officer trained in surveillance detection would naturally position themselves in restaurants or cafes where they could observe entrances and exits. They would use reflective surfaces to monitor who was behind them while walking. They would vary their routes and timing in ways that seemed random, but actually followed patterns taught in intelligence training. They would show heightened awareness during what the CIA called vulnerable moments, entering or exiting buildings, making telephone calls, or conducting any activity that might be observed. The KGB trained its surveillance personnel to recognize these patterns, understanding that the very training that made Western intelligence officers effective also made them identifiable to observers who knew what to look for. Communication methods represented another critical area of focus. The KGB maintained extensive technical capabilities to intercept and analyze communications, but they also understood that sophisticated intelligence services used methods designed to evade detection. Dead drops, where messages or materials were left in concealed locations for later retrieval, required the intelligence officer to visit locations that might have no obvious connection to their cover identity. The KGB response was to maintain surveillance not just on suspected intelligence officers, but on locations throughout Moscow and other major cities where dead drops might logically be placed: parks, public buildings, construction sites, and transportation hubs. Officers of the 7th Directorate, responsible for surveillance, maintained logs of everyone who visited certain locations, looking for patterns that might indicate dead drop servicing. The famous case of Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who spied for British and American intelligence from 1960 until his arrest in 1962, demonstrated both the power and the limitations of KGB detection methods. Penkovsky, a GRU officer with access to sensitive military intelligence, made contact with Western intelligence during a Soviet trade delegation visit to London in April 1961. He provided thousands of documents over the following 18 months, including critical information about Soviet missile capabilities that proved invaluable during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The KGB eventually detected Penkovsky not through sophisticated technical means, but through patient analysis of patterns. Surveillance teams noted that CIA officer Richard Jacob and British businessman Greville Wynne, who served as Penkovsky's handlers, made repeated visits to locations in Moscow that had no apparent business purpose. Simultaneously, KGB analysts noticed that Penkovsky's official duties provided him access to documents that subsequently appeared in Western intelligence assessments. The convergence of these patterns led to intensive surveillance that eventually caught Penkovsky in the act of servicing a dead drop in July 1962. His arrest in October 1962 and subsequent execution in May 1963 validated the KGB's methodical approach to counterintelligence. The KGB also developed sophisticated methods for detecting what they called agent networks, the local citizens recruited by foreign intelligence services to provide information or assistance. This aspect of counterintelligence proved particularly challenging because Soviet citizens who agreed to work for foreign intelligence were operating in their native environment, where their behavior would naturally appear less suspicious than that of foreign intelligence officers. The KGB's approach combined systematic monitoring of anyone who had contact with foreigners with analysis of lifestyle changes that might indicate payment from foreign sources. Bank accounts were monitored, although sophisticated agents would avoid depositing suspicious payments. Purchasing patterns were tracked through the limited retail system, where any acquisition of goods beyond one's apparent means might indicate hidden income. Social circles were mapped, looking for connections that might provide access to sensitive information or facilities. The recruitment of informants among the Soviet population represented perhaps the most extensive aspect of the KGB's detection apparatus. By the mid-1970s, Western intelligence estimates suggested that the KGB maintained files on approximately 50 million Soviet citizens, roughly 20% of the total population, and could call upon several million active informants who provided regular reports. These informants existed at every level of society, from custodial staff in sensitive facilities to high-ranking officials in government ministries. The motivations for cooperation varied widely. Some informants were ideologically committed to Soviet security, genuinely believing they were protecting the motherland from foreign subversion. Others cooperated out of fear, having been compromised through real or fabricated evidence of wrongdoing. Still, others were motivated by the modest privileges that cooperation could bring in a society where access to goods and opportunities was tightly controlled. The quality of information from this vast informant network varied enormously, and the KGB developed elaborate systems for evaluating and corroborating reports. A single informant's report that a colleague had expressed interest in foreign publications or had been observed in conversation with a foreigner would trigger a file opening but not immediate action. The KGB would task additional informants to observe the individual, creating multiple independent reporting streams. Only when patterns emerged across multiple sources would the organization escalate its response. This methodical approach helped avoid the worst excesses of the Stalin era, when single denunciations could lead to arrest and execution, though the system remained fundamentally oppressive and generated enormous files on individuals whose only crime was attracting suspicion. The KGB devoted particular attention to what they termed points of contact, the limited locations where Soviet citizens might legitimately interact with foreigners. These included international hotels, foreign embassy functions, academic conferences, cultural events, and certain restaurants and bars that accepted foreign currency. The organization maintained permanent surveillance on these locations and required Soviet citizens who had contact with foreigners in these venues to file reports detailing the nature of the interaction. Failure to report such contact could itself trigger suspicion. The American scholar Robert Kaiser, who spent 3 years in Moscow as a journalist in the early 1970s, later described the elaborate dance that Soviet citizens performed when interacting with foreigners, carefully calibrating their behavior to avoid appearing either too friendly, which might suggest recruitment potential, or too hostile, which might indicate they had something to hide. Language skills represented another indicator the KGB monitored carefully. The Soviet education system produced many citizens with foreign language capabilities, but the KGB maintained detailed records of who possessed advanced skills in English, German, French, or other languages that would make them valuable to foreign intelligence services. Citizens with such skills who also had access to sensitive information through their employment received enhanced scrutiny. The KGB would sometimes conduct what they called provocation operations, where an officer posing as a foreign businessman or journalist would attempt to strike up a conversation with a targeted Soviet citizen who possessed both language skills and access to valuable information. The goal was not necessarily to determine if the individual was already recruited, but to assess their susceptibility to recruitment and to identify them as a potential security risk before foreign intelligence services could approach them. The detection of what the KGB termed illegal agents, foreign intelligence officers operating under deep cover with false identities rather than diplomatic protection, represented the most challenging aspect of counterintelligence. These operatives, often called illegals in intelligence parlance, lived as Soviet citizens, sometimes for years, building authentic-seeming lives while conducting espionage. The KGB's primary defense against illegals was the comprehensive internal passport system that controlled where Soviet citizens could live and work. Every Soviet citizen was required to have their internal passport stamped with a residence permit for a specific city or region, and changing residence required official approval that involved background checks and documentation. This system made it extremely difficult for illegals to establish themselves in sensitive locations like Moscow or Leningrad without extensive preparation and documentation that could withstand scrutiny. When the KGB suspected the presence of an illegal agent, they would conduct what they called biographical excavation, a painstaking process of verifying every element of the suspect's claimed history. This might involve contacting schools they claimed to have attended, tracking down supposed childhood friends or relatives, examining medical records, and reviewing employment histories. Any gap or inconsistency would trigger deeper investigation. The case of Raino Heinonen, a KGB illegal who defected to the United States in 1957 and whose testimony led to the arrest of Rudolf Abel, demonstrated the vulnerability of even well-prepared illegals to this kind of systematic verification. Heinenen's defection shocked the KGB and led to a comprehensive review of how illegals were prepared and deployed, with new emphasis on creating verifiable biographical legends. The KGB also developed methods for detecting what they termed sleeping agents, foreign nationals who had been recruited by Western intelligence services before arriving in the Soviet Union, often years earlier. These individuals might be students, academics, or professionals who came to the Soviet Union for legitimate purposes, but who had secret tasking from intelligence services. The challenge in detecting sleeping agents was that they might not engage in obvious intelligence-gathering activities, instead focusing on establishing themselves in positions where they would have long-term access to valuable information. The KGB's approach involved long-term monitoring of foreigners who remained in the Soviet Union for extended periods, looking for any signs of intelligence training or suspicious contacts that might emerge over time. Financial intelligence formed another critical component of the detection apparatus. The KGB maintained close relationships with Soviet banking institutions and monitored international financial transactions for patterns that might indicate espionage-related payments. Foreign intelligence services needed methods to fund their operations and pay their agents, and the Soviet Union's controlled economy made this challenging. Payments in rubles were difficult to explain and provided limited purchasing power. Payments in foreign currency or valuable goods were more useful, but also more suspicious. The KGB looked for Soviet citizens who displayed wealth beyond their official income, who made unexplained foreign currency transactions, or who received packages from abroad that might contain payment or espionage equipment. The organization also paid careful attention to what they called motivation analysis, attempting to understand why a Soviet citizen might be vulnerable to recruitment by foreign intelligence. The KGB identified several categories of vulnerability. Ideological dissatisfaction with the Soviet system represented one category, and the organization maintained extensive surveillance of known dissidents and their contacts. Personal grievances, such as being passed over for promotion or facing professional setbacks, represented another vulnerability category. Financial pressure from debt or desire for luxury goods that were difficult to obtain in the Soviet economy created a third category. Personal relationships, including romantic or sexual connections with foreigners, represented perhaps the most exploitable vulnerability. The KGB would compile detailed assessments of individuals who fell into these vulnerability categories, particularly if they also had access to sensitive information. Technological developments during the Cold War created new challenges and opportunities for counterintelligence. The miniaturization of cameras, recording devices, and communication equipment made it easier for intelligence officers to operate covertly, but it also created new signatures that the KGB could detect. The organization invested heavily in technical capabilities to identify the electromagnetic emissions from concealed transmitters, to detect the chemical traces of certain types of film and photographic equipment, and to identify materials used in constructing espionage devices. The KGB's 16th Directorate, responsible for electronic surveillance and signals intelligence, developed increasingly sophisticated equipment for detecting clandestine communications, including burst transmissions that lasted only seconds and were designed to evade detection. The human element remained central to KGB counterintelligence methodology despite technological advances. The organization understood that intelligence work ultimately depended on human judgment, human relationships, and human vulnerabilities. The most sophisticated technical surveillance could be defeated by determined and well-trained operatives, but human psychology remained relatively constant. The KGB invested enormous resources in training its officers to understand human behavior, to recognize signs of deception, and to exploit psychological pressure. The interrogation techniques developed at the Lubyanka became legendary, combining psychological manipulation with the strategic use of evidence to break down resistance and extract confessions. The legacy of KGB counterintelligence methods extends far beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, known as the FSB, inherited not only the facilities and many of the personnel of the KGB, but also its institutional knowledge and methodological approach. Many of the detection techniques developed during the Cold War remain relevant in the contemporary era of espionage. The fundamental principles, systematic observation, pattern analysis, biographical verification, control of operational environment, and exploitation of human psychology, continue to form the basis of counterintelligence work worldwide. The comprehensive surveillance apparatus that the KGB built in Soviet society finds echoes in modern digital surveillance capabilities, though the technology has evolved from human informants and hidden microphones to data mining and electronic monitoring. Understanding the KGB's approach to detecting foreign spies provides insight into the broader nature of the Soviet system and the Cold War itself. The elaborate counterintelligence apparatus was both a cause and an effect of the profound mistrust that characterized Soviet society. The assumption that enemies were everywhere, that any foreigner might be a spy and any Soviet citizen might be a traitor, created a self-reinforcing cycle of surveillance and suspicion that permeated every aspect of life. The human cost of this system was enormous, measured not just in the lives of those arrested and imprisoned on espionage charges, some guilty and many innocent, but in the atmosphere of fear and constraint that affected millions who lived under constant awareness that they were being watched and assessed. The KGB's guide to detecting foreign spies was ultimately a guide to controlling an entire population, a testament to how security concerns, both genuine and exaggerated, can be used to justify comprehensive systems of monitoring and control that persist long after the specific threats that inspired them have faded into history.